On a humid morning in June 2018, in the middle of a Mozambican national park that had spent the previous 40 years on every conservation organization's list of lost causes, a steel gate opened in a 1-hectare holding pen, and 14 African wild dogs walked out into a landscape that had not heard the sound of a pack in more than a quarter century. A second translocation followed in 2019. By the time the founding population was complete, more than 24 wild dogs had been released into Gorongosa National Park, drawn from breeding programs across South Africa, carried by aircraft across international borders, and turned loose in a park that had lost more than 90% of its large mammals to a 15-year civil war. Paula Booley, the park's associate director of carnivore conservation, watched the first pack disappear into the floodplain and described what was coming in terms that would have sounded almost reckless if the team behind her had not been preparing for this moment for years. It was a wave of teeth, she said, and it was about to move through a park that had forgotten what teeth at the top of the food chain could do. What those 24 wild dogs and the packs they founded did to Gorongosa in the years that followed is a story that ecologists working in post-conflict landscapes had been waiting more than 3 decades to write. But before you can understand what wild dogs did to a destroyed park, you need to understand what the park had become and why most of the world had stopped believing it could be restored at all. Gorongosa National Park covers roughly 4,000 square kilometers of central Mozambique. Before 1977, it was one of the great wildlife landscapes of southern Africa. Herds of buffalo numbered in the thousands. Elephants moved across the floodplain in family groups that drew researchers from across the continent. Lions hunted in the woodlands. Wild dogs ran in packs across the grasslands. Sable antelope, eland, hippopotamus, and waterbuck filled the savanna in densities that visitors of the era described as among the most impressive in Africa. In 1977, the Mozambican Civil War began. It would last 15 years. By the time it ended in 1992, an estimated 1 million people had died, and the country's infrastructure, economy, and protected areas had been reduced to fragments. Gorongosa, sitting in a region that saw some of the war's most intense fighting, was emptied. Soldiers shot animals for food. Commercial poachers stripped the park of its ivory and its trophy species. The buffalo population, estimated at 14,000 before the war, fell to fewer than 100. Lions, hippos, hyenas, and zebra were reduced to fragments of their pre-war numbers. Wild dogs disappeared entirely. The park did not stop existing. The trees grew, the rivers ran, the seasonal floods came and went, but the ecological structure that had organized Gorongosa for tens of thousands of years, the predator-prey relationships, the seasonal movements, the regulation of grazing pressure had been removed in a single human generation. What remained was a landscape that looked, from the air, like wilderness. On the ground, it was an empty room. In 2004, an American philanthropist named Greg Carr signed a 20-year agreement with the Mozambican government to fund the restoration of Gorongosa. The agreement was renewed in 2018 and extended to a 25-year partnership. Through the Gorongosa Restoration Project, Carr committed tens of millions of dollars over multiple decades to rebuilding the park's infrastructure, training Mozambican rangers, restoring its herbivore populations, and over time, reintroducing the carnivores that had been driven out by the war. The early work was unglamorous. Anti-poaching patrols were rebuilt from the ground up. Roads and ranger posts were reconstructed. Local communities surrounding the park were brought into the project through education programs, agricultural development initiatives, and a deliberate strategy of ensuring that the park's recovery generated benefits for the people who lived alongside it. CAR's approach was direct. A national park surrounded by hostile communities cannot recover. A park whose neighbors depend on its survival can. The herbivore populations recovered first. Waterbuck, which had survived the war in higher numbers than other species, exploded across the floodplain. By the late 2000s and 10s, Gorongosa's waterbuck population had grown to one of the densest in Africa, with estimates of more than 60,000 individuals on the floodplain alone. Bushbuck, warthog, kudu, and other species followed. The grass was being grazed. The trees were producing fruit and browse for animals that had not been there to consume it for 30 years. But the park was running without brakes. Without large carnivores to apply top-down pressure, herbivore populations were growing in ways that the system had not evolved to support. Vegetation patterns were shifting. The behavioral cascades that healthy ecosystems depend on, the constant low-level vigilance of prey species shaping where and how they graze, were absent. Gorongosa had biomass. It did not yet have the structure that biomass needs to function. The wild dog was a deliberate choice as the first carnivore to return. Lions had survived the war in small numbers and were recovering on their own. Spotted hyenas were beginning to return. But the African wild dog, also called the painted wolf, had been extirpated completely from Gorongosa during the conflict, and the species had become one of the most endangered carnivores on the African continent. Fewer than 7,000 wild dogs were estimated to remain across the entire continent, scattered in fragmented populations from Botswana to Tanzania. Reintroducing wild dogs to Gorongosa would not just restore a missing piece of the park's food web, it would establish a new population of one of Africa's most threatened species in a protected area large enough to support long-term persistence. The Endangered Wildlife Trust in South Africa, working with the Gorongosa Restoration Project and provincial conservation authorities in South Africa's Northwest Province, agreed to a transboundary translocation. The first 14 dogs, 6 females and 8 males, were sourced from existing populations held in pre-release enclosures in Gorongosa to allow them to form pack bonds and released into the park in June 2018. A second pack of more than 10 additional dogs was translocated in 2019. Across the founding releases, the population of wild dogs in Gorongosa rose to roughly 24 founding animals, drawn from genetically diverse source populations to maximize the long-term viability of the new population. Each animal carried a GPS collar. Every kill site was investigated. Every pup born was counted. The dogs did not need instructions. They began hunting within days. Paula Bulli and her team, working with collaborators David Marnowek, Antonio Paulo, Mercia Angela, and Cole Duplessis, published the first comprehensive analysis of the reintroduction in PLOS1 in 2021. The data covered 28 months of intensive monitoring following the first releases. The results were unusual enough that they shifted the conversation about post-conflict ecosystem restoration across the African conservation community. In the first 3 breeding seasons, 82 pups were born. The founding packs produced young in 2 of the 3 seasons monitored. Survival rates across all reintroduced and wild-born wild dogs reached 73%, with all recorded mortality coming from natural causes, not poaching, not snares, not human conflict. The dogs from different source populations formed natural new packs through dispersal events, expanding the territorial footprint of the species across the park. Their hunting reshaped the prey base in ways the team had not fully anticipated. Lions in Gorongosa hunted primarily warthog and waterbuck, often on the floodplain. Wild dogs hunted primarily bushbuck and waterbuck, but in different habitats. Of the 23 confirmed waterbuck kills made by wild dogs during the study period, 10% occurred on the floodplain. Of the 27 confirmed waterbuck kills made by lions, 67% occurred on the floodplain. The two carnivores were operating in the same park, on overlapping prey species, but in distinct ecological niches. This was the structure that intact African ecosystems had always had, and that Gorongosa had not had since 1977. The wild dogs had not just survived the reintroduction, they had restarted a process that the war had interrupted. In March 2019, 9 months after the first release, the most intense tropical cyclone ever recorded in southern Africa made landfall in central Mozambique. Cyclone Idai dropped more than 200 millimeters of rain on Gorongosa in less than 24 hours. The park's floodplain, which typically covered 24 square kilometers in a wet season, expanded to 117 square kilometers. Floodwaters reached depths of nearly 6 meters in some areas. Wildlife biologists across the region braced for the worst. A founding population of an endangered carnivore species, less than a year after release, faced a 100-year storm event in the middle of its establishment phase. By the rules of conservation biology, this was exactly the kind of stochastic disaster that could undo a reintroduction program before it had time to take hold. The dogs survived. More than that, they thrived. The cyclone pushed waterbuck and other prey into areas the wild dogs had already begun to use. Hunting success increased. Pup survival continued. Both lion and wild dog populations grew in the years immediately following Idai. The natural disaster that should have crushed the reintroduction had instead accelerated it, because the carnivores that had been released into Gorongosa were doing what their species had done for millions of years and what the park needed them to do. One question shaped the project's relationship with surrounding communities from the beginning. Wild dogs are wide-ranging predators capable of moving more than 30 kilometers in a day. Across most of their range in Africa, the species comes into conflict with livestock farmers, and the resulting retaliatory killings have been one of the primary drivers of its decline. A founding population in Gorongosa would inevitably push outside the park's boundaries into areas where people lived. The Gorongosa Restoration Project's response was the same approach that had defined the broader restoration effort. The communities surrounding the park were partners, not adversaries. Education programs, employment opportunities in conservation and tourism, community health initiatives, and direct economic benefits flowing back to local villages built a base of support for the carnivore reintroductions before the dogs were released. When packs occasionally moved beyond the park's boundaries, response teams worked with local communities to monitor the animals, address conflicts directly, and prevent retaliatory action. The strategy was not perfect. It was, however, sustainable in a way that fortress conservation across most of Africa had not been. By 2025, the wild dog population in Gorongosa had stabilized at approximately 250 individuals across multiple packs, occupying significantly more of the park than they had in the early years, and beginning to push into corridors that connect Gorongosa to the wider Gorongosa Maromeo landscape to the east and north. By 2021, the program was producing animals for translocation to other parks. Wild dogs from Gorongosa were sent to Malawi to support reintroduction efforts in Gorongosa National Park. A site that had been a recipient of conservation rescue had, within 5 years, become a source population for other recovering ecosystems. The wider context of Gorongosa's recovery moved alongside the wild dogs. By 2025, the park's total mammal populations had grown by more than 700% compared to a decade earlier. Lion populations recovering naturally as prey returned and poaching decreased reached approximately 200 individuals. Buffalo and elephant herds expanded. Pollinator diversity in Mount Gorongosa's upper altitude forests reached levels not recorded since the early 1990s. The E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Laboratory, established within the park, documented species that had not been seen in Gorongosa since before the war. A park that had been written off as ecologically destroyed in 1992 had become, by 2025, one of the most cited examples of post-conflict ecosystem restoration in the conservation literature. The wild dogs had not done that alone, but their reintroduction had been the keystone moment. The species whose return had told the international conservation community that Gorongosa was no longer a story of loss. There is a stretch of floodplain in Gorongosa National Park, east of the old Chitengo camp, where the war had once left the buildings in ruins, where a research vehicle moves slowly along a dirt track at dawn. Waterbuck graze in herds on the open ground. A fish eagle calls from a tree at the floodplain margin. Somewhere in the woodlands beyond the visible edge of the grass, a pack of African wild dogs is bedded down after a morning hunt. The GPS collar on the alpha female transmits her position back to a research station where Paula Buli's successors continue the monitoring that began in 2018. 24 founding dogs drawn from South Africa across an international border. 82 pups born in 3 breeding seasons. A founding population that survived a 100-year cyclone in its first year. A wild dog population of approximately 250 animals in 2025. A park that has grown its mammal populations by more than 700% in a decade. A source population that now exports animals to other African parks attempting their own restorations. That is not a coincidence. That is what a keystone carnivore does when it is returned to a landscape that evolved with it, and what the landscape does when the predator is given the space, the prey, and the protection to be part of it again. But Mozambique is not the only country where a carnivore released into a damaged landscape has rewritten what conservation biologists thought was possible. In our next video, we travel to Yellowstone, where in 1995, 31 gray wolves were released into a park that had been without them for 70 years, and where the cascade that followed reshaped not just the animals, but the rivers themselves. If you thought 24 wild dogs rebuilding a war-shattered ecosystem was unexpected, wait until you see what 31 wolves did to the geography of an American national park. You will not look at predators the same way again.